June 4, 1942, Midway Atoll. The sky above the Pacific burned with the streaks of tracer fire and the black blossoms of anti-aircraft bursts. Japanese dive bombers roared downward, their engines howling as bombs fell toward the flat decks of American carriers. Explosions tore through steel and timber, sending plumes of smoke into the heavens. The USS Yorktown shuddered as a direct hit split her flight deck, flames racing along her surface. To the men aboard it felt like the end. Yet in the smoke and ruin, something remarkable stirred. The Japanese pilots, banking away from their targets, sent back triumphant reports to Admiral Nagumo. Another American carrier, crippled, perhaps sinking. The enemy should have been finished. And yet, as the day wore on like a ghost rising from the ocean's grip, American carriers reappeared on the horizon, scarred, battered, but fighting still. To the Japanese command it was impossible. Carriers could not endure such punishment. But here they were, returning again and again, launching aircraft as if death itself had been delayed. The air was thick with disbelief. Japanese officers peered through binoculars, scanning for the ships they were certain had been destroyed hours before. Smoke still curled from decks, yet American squadrons were airborne, their formations growing bolder, their strikes more coordinated. In that instant, the myth of Japanese invincibility cracked. Something in the American fleet, something in its engineering, its willpower, its crews, allowed ships to rise from apparent death. To the enemy it was supernatural resilience. To history it would become a turning point. The Yorktown had been struck, its engines silenced, fires raging. But damage control parties drenched in sweat moved with precision honed by drills. Bulkheads were sealed, fires suffocated, systems jury-rigged back into life. Men with scorched uniforms and blackened faces clawed their way through twisted steel, refusing to abandon their posts. Within an hour, steam built again, pumps throbbed, and flight operations resumed. From the Japanese perspective, it made no sense. Their doctrine dictated that a carrier once burning was lost. Yet here was Yorktown, rising from ruin like a phoenix, fueling planes, catapulting them skyward. It was more than steel. It was mindset. Japanese naval doctrine revered decisive strikes, assuming that once an enemy ship was crippled, it could be written off. Their own carriers had lighter armor, weaker firefighting protocols, and a fatal culture of perfection that left little room for improvisation. American carriers, by contrast, had been built with survival in mind. Bulkheads were reinforced. Redundant systems lay hidden within their frames. But most of all, American crews were trained relentlessly in damage control, core discipline that turned catastrophe into a challenge rather than a death sentence. As the sun climbed higher over Midway, the impossible repeated itself. Japanese aviators returned from strikes reporting yet again that American carriers had been mortally hit. Yet hours later, squadrons of dauntless dive bombers, torpedo planes, and wildcats clawed back into the sky, answering the call of ships their enemies believed sunk. The ocean itself seemed to defy logic, presenting to the Japanese eyes the same carriers they had already consigned to the deep. Admiral Nagumo's staff argued over reports. How could the same ship still launch planes? Were there more American carriers than their intelligence had claimed? Or had the enemy mastered some hidden art of survival? Confusion mounted into dread. Japanese crews, who once laughed at the notion of American seamanship, now whispered about the stubborn ghost ships that refused to die. To them it was as if Midway itself was conjuring reinforcements out of thin air. The truth was harsher. The Americans simply refused to let their carriers die. Every rivet, every weld, every pump was bent toward survival. Fire hoses hissed, foam sprayed across infernos, and men crawled through the smoke-choked passageways with nothing but determination to keep their ships breathing. On the bridge of the Yorktown, officers worked by the light of flickering lamps, steering a wounded beast through the waves. Below decks, sailors waded waist-deep in water, patching ruptures as pumps strained against the flood. In the engine room, men fought the rising heat to coax life back into turbines scarred by shock waves. Overhead, aircraft clawed into the air, some from patched flight decks, others from makeshift launching zones. Each plane that rose was another dagger aimed at the Japanese fleet. From the vantage of the Japanese High Command, the scene bordered on the surreal. Reports clashed with expectations. Carriers supposedly destroyed hours earlier re-emerged as launching platforms for the very squadrons tearing into Japanese decks. It was as if the ocean itself had betrayed them, hiding the truth within its horizon until the next wave of American planes descended. The disbelief seeped into strategy, clouding judgment and delaying decisions. By the time clarity arrived, it was too late. The Battle of Midway became not just a clash of ships and aircraft, but of philosophies. The Japanese sought perfection in strike execution, but faltered when the enemy refused to collapse under the weight of their blows. The Americans, battered but unbroken, embraced chaos, adapting to catastrophe and rising anew from devastation. In the plumes of smoke above Midway, the seeds of a larger truth revealed themselves. Survival could be as decisive as firepower, resilience as lethal as guns. For the men who lived it, the memory never faded. Sailors who dragged hoses across flaming decks, who patched holes with their bare hands, who kept engines humming with tools fashioned out of wreckage, carried those scars forever. They knew they had stood on the edge of destruction, stared into the abyss of the Pacific, and clawed their way back. And when they looked skyward and saw American squadrons still flying, still striking, still roaring toward the enemy, they knew their struggle had bought time, and that time meant survival. For the Japanese commanders, the lesson was far darker. Midway was not just the loss of carriers, it was the loss of certainty. The war they thought they understood, swift, decisive, unquestionable, was unraveling. The enemy was not supposed to return from the grave. Yet the Americans had done so again and again, their ghostly carriers refusing to vanish. In that disbelief lay the first fracture of an empire that would never recover. And so on that fateful day in June, as the Pacific roared with fire and smoke, history shifted. Carriers that should have been silent instead thundered back to life, their decks launching death into the skies. Against all logic, against all expectation, they endured. To the Japanese it was inconceivable, to the Americans it was survival, and to history it was the moment when the tide of war began to turn. By the summer of 1942, the Pacific was a vast chessboard of uncertainty. 6 months earlier, the attack on Pearl Harbor had plunged the United States into the war, crippling much of its Pacific fleet and leaving Japan with an aura of unstoppable momentum. The rising sun flag flew over territories stretching thousands of miles. The Philippines, Malaya, the Dutch East Indies, and vast swaths of the Pacific Islands. Japanese carriers, the sharp edge of this empire, had struck with precision and fury, devastating every foe they faced. From the Coral Sea to the Indian Ocean, they appeared invincible, their air wings coordinated with mathematical efficiency, their admirals confident in victory. But behind that confidence lurked a dangerous assumption. Japan believed the United States could not recover quickly from Pearl Harbor. Their intelligence dismissed American industry as slow and clumsy, their sailors as inexperienced and untested. To Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the architect of Pearl Harbor, the war was a race against time. Japan's best hope lay in striking decisive blows before American factories and shipyards could awaken to their full power. Thus the plan for Midway was born, a trap to draw out what remained of the American carriers, crush them in one stroke, and secure Japan's dominance of the Pacific. Yet, the Americans were not stumbling blindly. At Station Hypo in Hawaii, codebreakers had pierced the veil of Japanese communications. Through painstaking analysis, they deciphered fragments of the enemy's plans and identified AF, the Japanese code for Midway. Admiral Chester W. Nimitz, calm and deliberate, knew where the hammer would fall. Instead of walking into the trap, he set one of his own. Carriers Enterprise, Hornet, and the hastily repaired Yorktown would wait in ambush, hiding their strength until the moment was right. What Japan assumed would be an easy kill was instead a gamble against a nation now fighting with its back to the wall. The Japanese believed they held every advantage. 4 fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, escorted by battleships, cruisers, and destroyers. Their pilots were hardened veterans, survivors of countless engagements. Against them, the Americans had fewer ships, fewer planes, and crews still green in combat. Yet hidden in the imbalance was a factor the Japanese could not see. The Americans had studied their own weaknesses at Coral Sea, had learned bitter lessons in coordination and communication, and above all, had prepared for disaster. Where Japanese doctrine assumed perfection, American doctrine prepared for chaos. On June 4th, the battle erupted in waves of steel and fire. Japanese dive bombers descended on Midway Island, smashing fuel tanks and installations. Yet the defenders, though bloodied, held fast. From Midway's airstrips, Marine pilots launched in obsolete aircraft, charging headlong into formations of zeros. They were slaughtered in minutes, but their sacrifice disrupted the enemy's tempo. At the same time, American carriers, silent, unseen, waited to strike. To the Japanese, the battle seemed familiar at first. Their air groups executed precise attacks, their carriers maneuvered with elegance. But the first cracks began to show in the form of American resistance. Squadrons of torpedo bombers, obsolete TBD devastators, charged into their formations in suicidal bravery. They were cut down almost to the last plane, falling flaming into the sea. Yet their doomed assault forced Japanese carriers into constant evasive maneuvers, scattering their formation, depleting their fighters' fuel and ammunition. In the skies above, the balance was shifting. The American response came in a torrent. Dive bombers from Enterprise and Yorktown, guided by luck and instinct, found their way to the Japanese carriers just as they were rearming planes on deck. At 10:22 a.m., the heavens opened. Bombs screamed downward, striking Kaga, Akagi, and Soryu with devastating accuracy. In minutes, 3 of Japan's 4 carriers were burning wrecks. Their decks turned into infernos as aviation fuel ignited. The ocean was littered with debris, the air filled with smoke and the thunder of explosions, and yet the Japanese still believed they had inflicted mortal wounds of their own. Yorktown had been struck hard, her flight deck torn apart, her power systems crippled. In their eyes, the battle was still salvageable. Hiryu, the last intact carrier, launched wave after wave against the Americans, scoring more hits on Yorktown. To Admiral Nagumo's staff, this was confirmation. The enemy's carriers were finished. Victory, though costly, seemed within reach. What they could not comprehend was the American refusal to let their ships die. Damage control, drilled endlessly into every sailor, turned chaos into order. Fires aboard Yorktown were beaten back, bulkheads sealed and power coaxed into flickering life. Within hours, she was once again launching planes, a phantom rising from smoke and ruin. To Japanese spotters, it seemed another carrier entirely, as if the Americans possessed more ships than their intelligence had counted. The illusion deepened the confusion. This moment, when wrecked American carriers seemed to return from the abyss, was more than luck. It was the culmination of doctrine, engineering, and willpower. Japanese carriers, designed for offensive striking power, carried volatile fuel lines without sufficient protection. Damage control was a secondary thought, often left to chance. American carriers, by contrast, were built for survival. Redundancy, compartmentalization, and rigorous training turned their crews into firefighters as much as sailors. Where Japanese culture punished improvisation, Americans rewarded it, turning broken ships into makeshift fortresses. As the battle raged, the contrast sharpened. Hiryu's counterattacks bought Japan precious hours, but the reprieve was fleeting. By afternoon, American dive bombers descended upon her as well, striking with merciless precision. Soon Hiryu too was burning, her crew abandoning ship, her decks glowing red with fire. The mighty carrier force that had terrorized the Pacific only 6 months before was gone, 4 carriers lost in a single day. In Tokyo, disbelief turned to silence. How could American carriers keep fighting after being struck? How could planes rise from decks that should have been lifeless? To the Japanese command, it seemed the Americans had defied the laws of naval warfare. But the truth was more brutal. Midway was not just a clash of fleets, but of philosophies. One side relied on perfection, the other thrived on survival. And as the smoke cleared over the Pacific, one fact was undeniable. The tide of the war had shifted. The Japanese had lost their striking arm, their aura of invincibility shattered. The Americans, bloodied but unbroken, had proven that resilience could be as decisive as firepower. And for the men who had fought through fire and steel, the lesson was carved into memory. Ships may burn, but as long as men endured, the fight would go on. On the smoking horizon of the Pacific, Japanese commanders tried to make sense of what they were seeing. Hours earlier, they had watched Yorktown stagger under the impact of bombs and torpedoes. Her flight deck was torn, her machinery silent, her fate seemingly sealed. By every measure of Japanese doctrine, she was finished. Carriers did not recover from such wounds. They became floating coffins, waiting for the ocean to swallow them. Yet as the day wore on, reconnaissance reported something unthinkable. American planes were once again rising from a flat top. To Admiral Nagumo's staff, it appeared a second carrier had emerged. Confusion gripped the command tent. How many American carriers were truly out there? Had their intelligence failed so completely? Or was the enemy deploying some unfathomable trick? The truth was simpler yet more terrifying. Yorktown had not died. Her crew, drilled beyond exhaustion in damage control, had dragged her back from the abyss. Fire hoses hissed, pumps screamed, steel bulkheads groaned as men clawed through choking smoke to patch ruptures. Within an hour she was breathing again, her engines coughing back to life. Elevators rattled as they rose through twisted steel, clearing just enough space to hurl planes back into the sky. To the Japanese eye, it was witchcraft. To the Americans, it was survival by design. Here lay the hidden advantage, the secret weapon invisible to reconnaissance reports and spy networks. It was not a gun, not a torpedo, not even a ship. It was doctrine. It was the relentless American obsession with keeping ships alive. Where Japanese carriers were swift swords designed for offense, American carriers were iron hearts built to keep beating long after the first strike. The Japanese Navy prized precision and elegance. Their carriers, sleek and efficient, had dominated the seas in the opening months of the war. But in their pursuit of offensive power, they neglected redundancy. Fuel lines ran exposed beneath decks, turning into rivers of fire when struck. Firefighting equipment was limited, often left unmanned in the chaos of attack. And worse, the culture of perfection punished initiative. When flames roared, sailors hesitated, waiting for orders that came too late. American carriers were different. Every ship was a fortress of compartments, each sealed off from the next, designed to localize damage rather than let it spread unchecked. Pipes crisscrossed the decks, feeding water to hoses stationed at every corner. Foam sprayers, portable extinguishers, and sand buckets stood ready. But the true weapon was training. From the day they stepped aboard, American sailors were drilled to exhaustion in damage control. Fires were staged, bulkheads deliberately ruptured, chaos rehearsed until reaction became instinct. Sailors became firefighters, medics, and engineers all at once. When the bombs fell at Midway, they did not freeze. They acted. The Japanese could not comprehend it. To them, a carrier ablaze was a death sentence. To the Americans, fire was simply another battle to be fought. And this philosophy turned Yorktown into a ghost ship, one that could not be killed by conventional means. Intelligence officers in Nagumo's fleet struggled to explain the phantom carriers. Reports spoke of 3, perhaps 4 American flat-tops still launching aircraft, though Japanese estimates had predicted only 2. Some whispered that the Americans had deployed reinforcements, that Midway was crawling with carriers fresh from the mainland. Others believed they were witnessing an illusion, the same ship striking twice as if resurrected. The fog of war clouded their judgment, and in that fog fear took root. Behind this confusion lay another American advantage: adaptability. At Coral Sea just weeks before, American carriers had suffered grievous wounds. Lexington had been lost, Yorktown badly damaged. But the Americans had learned. They repaired faster. They adapted systems, they changed tactics. Their shipyards worked miracles, patching Yorktown in 72 hours, just enough to throw her back into the fight at Midway. It was a pace of recovery the Japanese could neither match nor imagine. For them, a ship knocked from the line was gone for months, if not forever. For the Americans, ships returned like vengeful spirits. This resilience was amplified by another silent edge: communication. American carriers operated as a network, their actions tied together by reliable radios that bound fleets and squadrons into one organism. Orders crackled across the ether, pilots redirected mid-mission, ships coordinated in ways the Japanese could not match. To Nagumo's men, the American squadrons seemed endless, flowing from carriers that should have been dead. But in truth, it was not more ships. It was better coordination, turning fewer assets into the illusion of overwhelming force. The disbelief among Japanese commanders bordered on denial. How could the Americans endure so much punishment? How could their carriers keep launching aircraft after absorbing mortal blows? Each fresh wave of American planes deepened the mystery. Reports were revised, then contradicted, then abandoned entirely. The Japanese no longer trusted their own reconnaissance. Certainty was dissolving into chaos, and in war, chaos is fatal. For the Americans, the advantage was not glamorous. It was sweat, drills, steel, and sheer stubbornness. It was young sailors suffocating beneath decks to patch holes, officers barking orders through smoke, engineers hammering machinery back to life with hands blistered from heat. It was survival embodied, and in the crucible of Midway, survival became victory. In Tokyo, as word of the defeat trickled back, disbelief hardened into bitter realization. They had underestimated the Americans. Their assumptions about fragility, about inexperience, about the supposed weakness of democracy's sailors were shattered. The carriers that should have sunk had not. The ghosts that haunted Midway were not illusions. They were the embodiment of a doctrine that valued life over perfection, resilience over spectacle. Midway revealed that Japan had not been fighting just ships and planes, but an industrial giant capable of rebuilding faster than destruction could keep pace. And within that giant, crews trained to wrest survival from chaos ensured that even crippled carriers remained weapons. To the Japanese, it was unthinkable. To the Americans, it was only the beginning. The deck of the USS Yorktown, scarred and blackened, was more than just steel. It was a living laboratory of resilience. Every rivet, every compartment, every hose had been designed with catastrophe in mind. Unlike their Japanese counterparts, American carriers were not simply striking swords. They were engineered as survivors. This was the hidden architecture of victory, invisible to the naked eye but decisive in battle. The Yorktown-class carriers embodied this philosophy. At over 800 feet in length, displacing more than 20,000 tons, they carried not only aircraft but the capacity to endure punishment. Their hulls were divided into watertight compartments, a design meant to keep ships afloat even when entire sections were flooded. Bulkheads could be sealed in minutes, isolating damage before it consumed the whole vessel. Below decks, the arteries of the ship, fuel lines, steam pipes, electrical wiring, were carefully routed with redundancies. If one system failed, another could take its place. To Japanese commanders, this seemed wasteful. To American crews at Midway, it meant survival. Central to this resilience was the American obsession with damage control. In peacetime, sailors spent countless hours fighting stage fires, sealing off compartments and improvising repairs. What seemed monotonous in drills became salvation in war. Fire was the deadliest enemy of a carrier, able to turn aviation fuel into rivers of flame. To fight it, American carriers carried foam dispensers, portable extinguishers, and extensive firefighting gear. Each sailor, regardless of specialty, was trained to pick up a hose or wield an axe. When bombs ripped through Yorktown, it was not heroics alone that saved her, but the collective muscle memory of a crew that had rehearsed disaster 1,000 times. Contrast this with the Japanese carriers. Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu were marvels of offensive design. They carried more aircraft than their American rivals, packed tightly on expansive hangar decks. But this efficiency was a double-edged sword. Fuel lines ran openly beneath decks, pumping volatile gasoline to planes waiting for launch. Bomb strikes that ruptured these lines turned hangars into furnaces, igniting stacked bombs and torpedoes stored nearby. Firefighting equipment was inadequate, and crews were neither trained nor encouraged to act independently. When disaster struck, hesitation proved fatal. A single bomb could doom an entire carrier. The American advantage was not just in survival, but in communication. The SCR-300 and SCR-522 radios, carried aboard ships and aircraft, created a web of coordination that the Japanese could not match. Japanese carriers relied on older, less reliable sets prone to static and interference. Orders often took minutes to transmit, leaving squadrons isolated in the chaos of battle. The Americans, by contrast, could redirect attacks in mid-air, coordinate strikes between carriers, and adapt in real time. This ability to adjust on the fly made their smaller numbers appear far larger. Even the aircraft themselves reflected this philosophy. The Douglas SBD Dauntless dive bomber, though slower than Japan's sleek Aichi D-3A Val, carried radios that allowed constant communication with their carriers. Pilots received updates, adjusted courses, and struck targets with precision. Japanese pilots, once launched, often became blind hunters. dependent on prearranged plans that unraveled with the first unexpected turn of battle. Behind these technologies stood American industry. Companies like RCA and Motorola churned out reliable radios by the tens of thousands, ensuring every plane and every ship could speak to one another. Naval shipyards on the east and west coasts operated day and night, repairing damaged vessels with unprecedented speed. Yorktown herself, battered at Coral Sea, had been patched in a mere 72 hours at Pearl Harbor, a feat the Japanese considered impossible. This industrial machine was not glamorous, but it was relentless. And at Midway, it ensured that American carriers could re-enter the fight faster than Japan could comprehend. Even in the smallest details, American design choices paid dividends. The elevators that raised planes from hangar to deck were built with redundancy, capable of operating despite partial damage. Fuel storage tanks were double-walled, minimizing leaks when struck. Ventilation systems allowed smoke to be cleared faster, giving firefighters a fighting chance. These were not dramatic features, but they were decisive. At Midway, they meant the difference between a ship consumed in minutes and one that lived to launch a second, even a third wave of aircraft. The Japanese saw none of this. From their perspective, American carriers seemed to defy destruction, reappearing like phantoms. They did not understand that beneath the smoke and flame lay engineering that anticipated catastrophe, and crews trained to master it. To them, it was as if the Americans possessed more ships than they truly did. In reality, they simply possessed ships that refused to die. As Yorktown's fires were beaten back and her engines roared once more, she symbolized the invisible edge of American naval warfare. Her survival was not an accident nor a miracle. It was the deliberate outcome of doctrine, training, and technology. The Japanese carriers, by contrast, were designed for offense but carried within them the seeds of their own destruction. At Midway, when bombs found their decks, they burned with terrifying speed, their crews powerless to save them. This contrast, resilience against fragility, adaptability against rigidity, was the hidden advantage that decided the fate of the Pacific. The Japanese had better pilots, more experience, and greater momentum. But the Americans had ships that could take punishment, radios that kept fleets united, and an industrial base that repaired in days what should have taken months. It was not glamorous, but it was lethal. At Midway, these hidden strengths emerged not as background details, but as the very reason the Americans prevailed. For every Japanese commander who stared in disbelief at the horizon, wondering how a carrier thought dead could rise again, the answer was buried in steel bulkheads in radio frequencies, in men sweating through drills long before the first bomb fell. The advantage was hidden, not because it was invisible, but because the Japanese had never considered survival as a weapon. September 19, 1944. The skies above Lorraine, France, were thick with autumn haze as 39 German Panthers rolled forward in a line of steel. Their engines growled like predators as they advanced toward the American-held village of Aracourt. To the Wehrmacht, this was to be a swift strike, a show of armored dominance to crush the young American crews standing in their path. Yet what followed was not dominance but confusion, a clash where the unseen American edge once again turned the tide. This was not Midway nor the vast Pacific, but the story was the same. An enemy convinced it had destroyed its foe, only to face ships or tanks that refused to vanish. At Midway, this phenomenon had been born at sea. Japanese pilots returned from their runs reporting American carriers hit, crippled, and finished. Yet hours later, they found the same ships launching aircraft again as if no bomb had ever struck them. The disbelief hardened into dread because it shattered the assumption that one strike meant one kill. Yorktown had demonstrated this with brutal clarity. Struck by bombs that tore her deck apart, she had been written off by Japanese observers. But in reality, her crew fought like demons to save her. Within an hour, hoses doused the flames, bulkheads sealed the flooding, and the ship rose back into the fight. The first major battle to showcase this advantage came not just from Yorktown, but from the collective American fleet at Midway. Soryu, Kaga, and Akagi were all lost within minutes of one another, but Yorktown refused to die. Even after Hiryu's counterstrikes landed direct hits, plunging her into silence, she recovered once more. To the Japanese pilots circling above, it was impossible. How could a ship burning so furiously still launch aircraft? Their reports grew contradictory. Some claimed Yorktown was gone. Others swore a new carrier had appeared. In truth, it was the same battered vessel, defying expectation through sheer resilience. The illusion of multiple carriers was not simply a trick of smoke or horizon. It was the product of American doctrine. Damage control was not improvisation. It was a weapon. Fires were fought with foam sprayers stationed at every corner. Pumps roared as water was driven from flooded compartments. Below decks, sailors crawled through flames and toxic air to patch ruptures with makeshift tools. Where Japanese carriers surrendered to fire in minutes, American carriers bought hours, sometimes days. And in those hours they could still strike. The Japanese experienced this horror in real time at Midway. After Yorktown had been crippled, she launched planes that found and struck Hiryu, the last operational Japanese carrier. By late afternoon, Hiryu too was ablaze, her decks glowing, her crew abandoning her to the sea. In their after-action reports, Japanese officers admitted they were baffled. They had sunk Yorktown at Coral Sea, only to see her again at Midway. They had bombed her to destruction in the morning, only to see her squadrons rise in the afternoon. It was as if the Americans had conjured ships from thin air, each one returning from the grave to deal another blow. Numbers tell the story with brutal clarity. At Midway, the Americans lost the Yorktown, but only after she absorbed multiple bomb and torpedo strikes over the course of 2 days. She endured punishment that would have annihilated a Japanese carrier within minutes. The Japanese, by contrast, lost 4 carriers in a single day, each consumed by flames within an hour of being hit. The disparity was staggering. For every minute the Americans clawed back, the Japanese lost entire ships. This resilience became a force multiplier. In theory, the Japanese had superior numbers, 4 carriers to America's 3. But in practice, the Americans could strike again and again, even when their ships were mortally wounded. Each squadron that rose from Yorktown or Enterprise carried the weight of survival behind it. Japanese crews, expecting to see crippled ships sink silently, instead faced opponents who grew stronger as the day wore on. The psychological toll was immense. German tank crews at Aracourt in 1944 would later experience the same disbelief. Watching American Shermans reappear after being hit, repaired overnight by tireless mechanics, and thrust back into battle. But for the Japanese in 1942, Midway was the first taste of this nightmare. They realized their opponents were not bound by the same rules of destruction. Where they saw fire and assumed death, the Americans saw fire and assumed another battle to be fought. For the Japanese aviators, each return flight became a journey into uncertainty. What ships awaited them on the horizon? Were they striking the same carrier they had bombed before? Or was it a phantom, another vessel rising from the sea? Conflicting reports sowed chaos in Nagumo's fleet. Decisions were delayed, counter-strikes confused, and timing, so critical in carrier warfare, was lost. By the time clarity emerged, their carriers were burning, their air groups annihilated, their fleet broken. This was the essence of the first major battle example, the carriers that refused to die at Midway. The Japanese thought they had dealt a mortal blow. In reality, they had only provoked a ghost, one that lingered long enough to strike back. Yorktown's survival delayed Hiryu's triumph. Her planes delivered the fatal blow that ended the battle. And in that moment, the myth of Japanese invincibility crumbled. The American resilience at Midway was not luck. It was the deliberate product of design, training, and culture. Every bulkhead, every hose, every drill had prepared the fleet for this crucible. Japanese carriers built for speed and striking power crumbled when touched by fire. American carriers built for survival endured until the enemy was destroyed. In the smoking wreckage of Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, the lesson was carved in steel and flame. Perfection dies quickly, but resilience endures. Midway proved that the first strike is not always the last, and that sometimes the ships that should sink rise again to decide history. The days and nights after Midway were haunted by more than the stench of burning fuel and the silence of sinking ships. For the Japanese, the deeper wound was not physical, but psychological. Their proud carrier fleet, once the spearhead of expansion, had been obliterated in less than 24 hours. 4 fleet carriers, the core of the Kido Butai, were gone. But what stung even more was the manner of their defeat. They had not been outgunned, nor outnumbered in the opening hours. They had been outlasted. American carriers had refused to die. This fact shattered the Japanese understanding of naval war. Their doctrine assumed that once struck, a carrier was finished. Their own experience confirmed it. Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu had each succumbed to fire in less than an hour after bomb hits. Flames leapt from hangars stacked with armed aircraft, fuel ignited in rivers, and firefighting efforts collapsed into chaos. The ships went from dominance to wreckage in the span of a heartbeat. The Americans, however, had demonstrated a philosophy alien to Japanese eyes. They fought not only to strike, but to endure. Yorktown, mortally wounded multiple times, kept clawing back into the fight. Enterprise and Hornet weathered near misses, shockwaves, and fires, yet remained operational. To Japanese observers, this was sorcery. To the Americans, it was discipline. Every sailor was a damage control officer, every compartment a battlefield. The survival of a ship was not the captain's responsibility alone. It was the mission of every hand aboard. This resilience rippled outward, changing the psychological landscape of the war. Japanese pilots, once brimming with confidence, now hesitated. Reports grew contradictory. Were they striking new carriers or the same ones resurrected? The illusion of endless American strength gnawed at morale. For commanders, the uncertainty was paralyzing. If a ship that seemed crippled at 10 a.m. could be launching planes at 2 p.m., then no calculation was safe. Every assumption about the balance of forces was now suspect. On the American side, the impact was profound. Sailors felt an almost spiritual connection to their vessels. They had seen their ships torn open, engulfed in fire, yet still fighting. So that resilience became a source of pride, a bond between crew and steel. Men spoke of their ships as living beings, stubborn and unyielding, partners in survival. When Yorktown's planes rose into the sky after her first battering, the cheers from her decks carried more than relief. They carried conviction. These ships were not expendable. They were warriors. Strategically, the advantage was immense. American resilience bought time. Time for aircraft to launch one more strike. Time for squadrons to return, rearm, and attack again. Time for decisions at the highest level to shift the tide. At Midway, minutes determined victory. The Japanese lost theirs in confusion and delay. The Americans gained theirs by refusing to sink. That time translated into opportunity, and opportunity became annihilation. For the Japanese, the psychological collapse was compounded by the loss of trust. Commanders no longer believed reconnaissance reports. Pilots no longer believed their own eyes. When American carriers reappeared after supposedly being destroyed, doubt became a weapon. Every decision Nagumo made from that point forward was infected with hesitation. Should he launch? Should he wait? Was the enemy crippled or lurking? The uncertainty crippled the speed and decisiveness that had once been Japan's hallmark. The toll extended beyond the battle. In the months that followed, Japanese sailors carried the memory of Midway with them. Each time they faced American carriers, the ghosts of Yorktown and her sisters lingered. They remembered the ships that rose from smoke, the squadrons that should not have flown. Confidence cracked, replaced by unease. If the Americans could survive such punishment, then perhaps they could not be beaten at all. For the Americans, the lesson became doctrine. Midway proved the value of damage control, of redundancy, of training that treated fire and flood as enemies equal to torpedoes and bombs. Naval officers expanded drills, increased equipment, and doubled down on the principle that a ship must be ready to fight until the sea claimed her. Crews embraced it with pride, knowing that their survival and victory rested on their ability to keep steel alive under impossible conditions. This resilience was more than technical. It was cultural. American society, with its emphasis on improvisation and problem-solving, translated naturally into the chaos of damage control. Sailors did not wait for perfect orders. They acted, adapted, and fought fires with whatever tools they had. A wrench became a weapon, a piece of wood a makeshift brace. That culture of initiative stood in stark contrast to Japanese rigidity, where deviation from plan was often punished. In the inferno of carrier warfare, flexibility proved stronger than precision. The psychological chasm widened as the war dragged on. At Leyte Gulf, in the Philippine Sea, and across the Central Pacific, Japanese crews entered battles already haunted by doubt. American carriers were no longer just ships. They were symbols of inexhaustible endurance. Each time bombs and torpedoes struck, and each time the flat tops returned to launch more aircraft, the myth grew. By 1944, Japanese commanders openly admitted that they could no longer comprehend how the Americans kept their ships fighting. The phrase unsinkable began to circulate, not as myth but as despair. For the men aboard those carriers, the psychological impact was different, but no less profound. They lived with constant fear, the heat, the smoke, the deafening roar of explosions, yet they also carried pride. They had looked death in the face and held their ground. Every man who dragged a hose across a burning deck, who patched a hole in the dark, who kept an engine turning against all odds, became part of a story larger than himself. Together, they proved that survival was not passive endurance, it was an act of defiance. At Midway, this defiance shaped the course of the war. Strategically, it robbed Japan of its carrier arm. Psychologically, it robbed them of certainty. And in war, the loss of certainty is often the first step toward defeat. The Americans had shown that they could take the worst blows and still fight on. The Japanese had no answer. The echoes of Midway did not fade with the smoke that drifted over the Pacific. They reverberated through the remainder of the war, through the halls of strategy, and into the doctrines of the future. The sight of American carriers returning from ruin, of ships, thought-destroyed hurling squadrons back into the fight, etched a lesson into history. Survival could be as decisive as striking power. For Japan, the loss of 4 carriers at Midway was not merely tactical, it was existential. The Kido Butai, the pride of their navy, had been annihilated. With it, perished hundreds of irreplaceable pilots and deck crews, veterans whose skill could not be manufactured overnight. Factories could build new ships, but they could not rebuild the years of combat experience lost in a single battle. Worse still, the aura of invincibility surrounding the Imperial Navy evaporated. From Pearl Harbor to the Indian Ocean, Japan had seemed unstoppable. Midway revealed the truth. Their edge was brittle, their resilience paper-thin. American carriers, by contrast, became the heart of a new strategy. They were not merely floating airfields, but instruments of endurance. Their survival at Midway convinced U.S. commanders that carrier task forces could absorb punishment and keep fighting. This realization transformed naval doctrine. No longer would battleships dominate the seas. The future belonged to the flat tops, to vessels that projected power not just once but continuously. So long as their crews could hold them together, the psychological impact was equally profound. Japanese crews entered later battles with memories of Midway shadowing them. Every time an American carrier survived a strike, every time planes clawed into the sky from decks that should have been silent, despair deepened. At the Philippine Sea in 1944, the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, Japanese pilots flew into battle already convinced of American superiority. They faced not only flak and fighters, but the haunting belief that no matter how hard they struck, the enemy would not fall. For American sailors, Midway became a legend whispered on darkened decks. They told stories of Yorktown's ghostly resilience, of flames beaten back by exhausted hands, of aircraft rising from blackened runways. These tales were not myths. They were reminders of what discipline and unity could achieve. Crews drilled harder, fought fires faster, and carried with them the certainty that their ships could endure anything. This faith became a weapon in itself, binding men together in the furnace of war. Strategically, the resilience of American carriers altered the tempo of the conflict. Japan's strategy relied on quick, decisive battles that crippled the enemy before their industrial might could awaken. But when American carriers refused to sink, when damaged ships returned in weeks instead of months, that strategy unraveled. Japan could not replace losses as quickly as America could recover. The advantage of time shifted. Every day that American carriers survived was another day factories in Detroit, Seattle, and San Francisco churned out new planes, new ships, new weapons. Resilience at sea bought time on land, and time in total war was victory. The legacy extended beyond World War II. In the Cold War, the lesson of Midway was institutionalized into doctrine. Carrier battle groups were built not just for offense but for survivability, with layered defenses, redundant systems, and crews trained relentlessly in crisis management. The same principles carried into the Gulf War, where American carriers projected power across continents with the same philosophy: strike hard, survive harder, and strike again. Modern warfare embraced the idea that connectivity and resilience outweighed sheer firepower. Even today, the concept endures. Network-centric warfare, the digital descendant of Midway's lessons, relies on connection, redundancy, and adaptability. Satellites, drones, and carriers form webs of survival, ensuring that no single strike can decapitate a force. The spirit of Yorktown's survival lives on in the hardened data lines, the redundant command centers, the philosophy that a force must endure its first blow to deliver its last. For the Japanese, the lesson was bitter but undeniable. Field Marshal Keitel, years later, would summarize the truth with stark clarity. "We built better tanks, but you built tanks that worked together." The same applied to the seas. Japan built carriers that struck brilliantly, but died easily. America built carriers that endured, and endurance proved decisive. The Battle of Midway remains one of history's most studied clashes, not just for its drama, but for its revelation. It showed that the measure of a navy was not the speed of its planes or the sharpness of its strikes, but the ability of its ships to survive and return fire. It proved that in modern war, perfection is fragile, but resilience is immortal. As the sun set over the Pacific that June, the waters carried the wrecks of Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu into silence. Yet on the American side, battered carriers still steamed, still flew their squadrons, still carried the fight forward. In that contrast lay the war's outcome. The rising sun had met its eclipse, not by overwhelming force, but by ships that refused to die. The legacy of Midway whispers through history with a single, enduring truth. In modern war, connection outweighs firepower, and survival is the ultimate weapon. A carrier that can rise from ruin is not just a ship, it is a statement. And at Midway, that statement was made in fire, steel, and the unyielding will of men who refused to surrender their decks to the sea.